Yeah, I'm appreciative that Craig's asked us to do this session for quite some time, and I'm really thankful that Judy Racoosin, Paul Stang, and Marc Overhage could make time to join us, as well as many other familiar faces active in our community, including Marc and David and Christian. We talk a lot about joining the journey and trying to be on this journey ahead, but for many of you, this journey has started relatively recently over the last couple of years. And there's a history to what's gone on to get us to the point of the OHDSI community and the work that you hear George and I actively advancing, but it hasn't really started in a silo. And actually, a lot of this work got started with the original project that was the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, or OMOP. And some of you have heard in some of the tutorials, if you've taken the Eden Academy classes, you'll occasionally hear Christian or I provide a very short anecdotes about it. But we thought it would be useful to have those that were there at the start of OMOP share some history and some reflections about the work that took place there. And I think actually, particularly as we're now looking, OMOP started back in 2007. So we're now looking at entering into kind of 15 years from the start of this journey. And within OHDSI, we're now going to be going into our 8th year as an open science community. And it's useful at these kind of moments to kind of take stock of what's happened and reflect on where we were back then and what questions we were trying to tackle, and then try to go on to think about what that actually means for all of us moving forward. And so today's conversation, we're going to not have any PowerPoint slide presentations, but instead we're just going to have a series of conversations here. We're going to start by just talking about the background setting. Paul and Judy and Marc are going to share kind of their perspectives of some of the elements that went into OMOP initially. Then we're going to do a series of lightning round questions to get some fresh takes on some of the things that happened back then. Got a little game show planned for contrasting the then of OMOP versus the now of OHDSI. But then hopefully we're going to have some time for some open-ended questions. And I'm going to be monitoring the chat here. So if anyone on the call is looking for insights from those that have been around from the start, this is a great opportunity to engage in that conversation. So please use the chat to post any questions you might have or curiosities. So with that, Paul, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind kicking it off. You and I were at the very start when we were assigned to go join a pharma working group back in like 2007 timeframe. Could you just share with the group kind of like where did OMOP actually originally start, and how did it even become OMOP the entity?
Thanks, Patrick. I want to remind people that back when this was happening, and I think Judy will dig in a little bit more, the context was around drug safety. There was a lot of discussion around drug safety. People were starting to catch on that there were these large databases. And I think several of us who were in the industry at the time were trying to get our management, particularly our chief medical officers, to support this audacious idea of doing large-scale experiments to better understand the decisions that scientists have to make as they do these studies. I think a lot that you hear in OHDSI and that you hear in general is about informing decisions that clinicians or regulators make. But when we really started to think about it, there were a lot of decisions that were made that seemed somewhat arbitrary. So the chief medical officers of many of the pharma companies were willing to put up support and set up through the Foundation for the National Institute of Health the ability for us to do a public-private partnership, which involved people, for the scientists from industry, from academia, and from the regulatory authority in the US. So that was really the founding of OMOP, and I think Judy has a really good focus on what the context was from the regulator side. So maybe Judy, you can fill in some of that.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So around 2005, FDA asked the Institute of Medicine to do an examination of what I'm going to put in air quotes as the drug safety system in the US, because that if anything, that is a very loose concept. And as Institute of Medicine does, they bring people together they have these meetings and gather information, then they use all of that information that they gather from the meetings to write a report. So they wrote this Future of Drug Safety report that came out in 2006. And there were recommendations for FDA, and there were recommendations for the US Congress. And what came out of that was the Fda Amendments Act of 2007. So for those of you who work in the drug safety realm, this was the law that authorized FDA to be able to require safety labeling changes and REMS, or risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, and the PMRs, the post-market required studies, for safety. But in addition to those safety authorities, the Fda Amendments Act of 2007 required that FDA create a resource using electronic health data to inform medical product safety surveillance. And I do want to just put into context, we actually published a paper in 2010 from out of our original OMOP group that lays out, it's called Advancing the Science for Active Surveillance, Rationale and Design for the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership. So for those of you who are intrigued by this discussion this morning, you can go back to the Annals of Internal Medicine 2010. Maybe we can make this available somehow if people are interested. But I just want to, kind of the official words were that Congress mandated that the FDA
Nope, we lost Judy there. That's what happens when you try to silence a government official. While we're waiting for Judy.
Collaborate with public academic entities to ask.
We lost her there. So Marc, while we're waiting to get Judy back, maybe you could comment. So the prevailing problem was drug safety, the idea that we actually wanted to identify risks, but we kind of did something a little bit different. We didn't just go off and build a risk identification system. You want to talk about kind of your take on our experimental design?
Yeah, and many of you have heard me say the thing that I always found most fun and exciting about OMOP, it was the chance to do the science of science, right? All of us have been out doing, various health services research studies, health economics studies, different kinds of observational studies. And frankly, in some ways, the poor stepchild, right? Especially for life sciences companies, we don't believe that stuff. It's not reproducible. It's not consistent. We don't believe it. And I'm exaggerating. That's not that people didn't believe it, but there were great examples of inconsistent findings, not reproducible findings, and so on. And so we got the chance to ask that question, why, which I thought was just phenomenal. That pharma, the life sciences organizations, as well as the NIH and FDA, thought that was worthy of effort. And just to bring you guys back a minute, because you may not appreciate how modest, and it was pretty ambitious at the time, but how modest by your standards today this work was, in the sense that we said, well, in order to understand this, let's take, a modest subset of methods. I can't remember, Patrick, exactly. It's like 10 to 14, something like that. 10 drugs, 9 adverse outcomes known, quote unquote, to be associated with the drugs, 2 positive outcomes associated with the drugs, and 44 known negative outcomes associated with the drugs. And said, let's ask the simple question of, for those drugs, for those outcomes, if we use all of those 14 methods with their variants, 0 day, 3 day, whatever the windows are, et cetera, in multiple databases, and I think we had 5 or so large commonly used databases and 6 data collaborators, so primarily academic medical centers who had EMR data. So we were asking that claims almost versus EMR. I don't think we'd ask the question that way today. And said, what did we learn? Which methods work better for which questions, and what were the underlying factors? And it was just an amazing opportunity to start to say, partly what is it that goes on in the heads of smart analysts around the world, lots of bright epidemiologists who'd build these analyses, pick the database, carefully craft the question, and create their best answer. And then to be able to say, golly, how does that stack up against what the whole array of options were? Was that the best choice for a design? What were those parameters optimal to answer the question? And of course, like all good questions, that led to lots of other questions. But Paul, maybe you could talk for just a second about, I think that led us very quickly to the question of, well, would a smart person have chosen that design, or or were just not so smart people choosing that design, and how we kind of dived into the question of what's going on in epidemiologists' head as they design these studies, so that we could contrast and compare it with what we were learning from these very, at the time, large-scale empirical analyses.
Yeah, so we were struck by heterogeneity all over the place, particularly if you looked at publications. It was not unusual to find examples where the exact same data set was used, even the same method, but getting completely opposite answers. And those have been the fodder for a lot of presentations through the years. We decided, after some of the experiments that Marc was describing around heterogeneity of the data, source, the method, or the definitions of phenotypes, we were going to do a survey and just put out to experts, these are PhD trained epidemiologists, how they would, what their strategy would be around some scenarios. And what we found, I think we had just over 100 respondents to our survey, was there is unbelievable heterogeneity just in the decisions being made. So everywhere we looked, we saw variation in decisions being made. I think I might have been the only formally trained epidemiologist at the time, and it was forcing me to rethink things that were, in textbooks that we just accepted outright. So it was an interesting time. So we did launch something called EDI, which was a survey, and we published the results, but it basically documents that among this group of 100 experts, there was no consistency in strategies or even implementation to some very common scenarios.
Judy, we lost you as you were reviewing the Fda language. I'll definitely make sure that we paste that into the chat. Maybe just to take a step back, could you talk a little bit about, so we had legislation that mandated that the FDA create a risk identification system. And as Marc just introduced, OMOP was a component of that, trying to do this methodologic research. But could you provide some context for kind of the broader effort that you and others at the FDA were kind of in the midst of?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Great. So, out of this Fda Amendments Act of 2007, in order to implement this call to create an electronic, a system using electronic health records for medical product safety surveillance, the agency created the Sentinel Initiative, and with the intent of this system being called the Sentinel system. And so the two main components of the Sentinel Initiative were a pilot called Mini Sentinel that was contracted out to the Harvard School of Public Health, and they created a system in which there was a methods core, a data core, and a clinical core to figure out how to do all of this. And then there was OMOP, which was doing the data development and the methods development. And so, and then in addition to those two, we actually also had something called the Federal Partners Collaboration, where FDA and CMS and, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the VA system, the Veterans Health Administration, and Department of Defense, the medical folks there, that we also had a collaboration using these data, some data sources to investigate various safety issues that were coming up. But at the beginning of this, the extent that the expertise for how to do this create this kind of system was not, and it still isn't in the agency. It's outside, and that's where developing this kind of collaboration with with academia, with industry, with other regulatory agencies. That's really, we were building this thing from the ground up. As far as my recollection is that the only group that was doing something like this was the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which was about 8 HMOs in the US that were working together with a common data model and using a rapid cycle analysis to look at safety issues with vaccines. And that was kind of where we started our learnings, but it really was. We had a series of seminars with people in the field who were doing this, and that we could that we could learn from, and build up this infrastructure to do this work. Oh, and I was the Sentinel Initiative scientific lead from February of 2009 to September of 2011. So that's how I happen to have the great honor to work as part of this team.
And Judy, one of the areas that you were passionate about back then, and even still as you are active in our community, you continue to try to drive home, is the importance of phenotyping. I wonder if you just could share a little bit about what phenotyping even was back then, and what the problem was back then, and how you've seen that, what the importance that you had particularly placed on the value of validation. If you could just share some perspectives about what that problem was back then. Or not, as the case may be, and that would be totally fine too. I think that actually Zoom and MS Teams probably have a patent on figuring out how to take the most awkward still frame photo when someone breaks out of a meeting. So they've got good machine learning to solve that. Maybe Marc, I'm going to pivot over to you. For many of the people in the community, we've got about 200 people on the call here today. Many of them are relatively new to the OHDSI community, and when they hear OMOP, they only think of one thing, which is the OMOP Common Data Model. You were the author of the original validation of a common data model for safety surveillance paper that kind of started this. Could you just talk a little bit about your reflections on the origins of the OMOP Common Data Model, and where and why we got there?
Well, first, my apologies for inflicting it on everyone. No, it's really, I think it is one of the nice artifacts, if you will, produced out of some of the early work. But, the genesis, of course, and so I, joining the team here, and I think was one of the real amazing things we had, is we had a fantastic team of collaborators, even then, not as great and large as we have today, but folks who were card-carrying epidemiologists like Paul, and analytical folks, and visualization folks, and computing folks, and Marc Souchard, your great work early on in performance. So we had this fantastic group of people with all these different pieces, and I was probably the healthcare informatics geek. I'd done a fair amount of health services research and things, so appreciated some of the problems and challenges. But I think at least early on, part of my contribution was how to think about the data in a way that was reusable, and really became the criticality of having a common data model. And all of you may take this somewhat for granted, but frankly, I don't think at the time it was widely accepted that in order to have reproducible, scalable methods, you needed to have a common data structure to write against. And it's not just in analytics like this that we've seen this. I think we're still struggling with this, for example, in clinical decision support. How do you write an algorithm that applies if you don't have the same data model, and be able to move it from institution A to institution B? And that's partly been helped by EMRs and so on, but But really the driving force to me was the ability to create, to do many, many methods, write them in a consistent fashion, apply them across different drugs. You needed a common way to have the data represented. And it was critical not just to make it feasible, but also to be able to validate and test and reproduce. So, that was a really critical part of it, to get to these, what I think somewhat pejoratively were sometimes referred to as canned methods. Instead of handcrafting the SAS that was going to do things, we were trying to write the methods once and reuse them for many different things, so that we didn't have the errors and questions that creep in when those things get handcrafted. The second sort of factor, I think, is, historically, I mean, it's always been a mixed bag, but a lot of the observational research that had been done to date have used claims data. And we felt like there was an opportunity, and I think, Judy, the agency, this was part of the motivating factors, were beginning to look at how do we bring in clinical data, which we thought would be more nuanced, more informative than just claims data. Obviously, lots of stuff you can do with just claims data, but hopefully, and I think that's still an aspiration today, right, to do more with the clinical data that were available. And really trying to learn where claims data, to some extent, because of standardization of claim submission and things like that, was a little more manageable, less complexity. People could kind of get their heads around it. It wasn't as big an issue. But we started bringing in even just basic clinical data, laboratory results and things like that. We really had to come up with a way. And we leaned heavily on historical work, not only of standards like HL7 version 2 and the ill-fated version 3, but on the work that people like George Ripsack had done at Columbia, and other people at Duke and Vanderbilt and Reagan Street Institute in Indiana and places like that, and kind of extrapolated, if you will, to say, how do you make this generic enough, not tailored to any one place or site or perception, but generalizable, and generalizable not just for drug safety, but for other kinds of research questions, even then realizing that, as an observational data question, not just a drug safety question that we were trying to tackle. And the last little bit, I think, is, terminology mapping, which is still the bane of everybody's existence today when we integrate data. Even in our world of FHIR and national standards in many countries and things like that, terminologies and mappings are still critical. And I think we're really lucky, like Christian Reich, for example, just grabbed a hold of that and hammered to the ground. Okay, we're going to pick this to represent drugs and this to represent diagnoses, and a good enough set of mappings to get started with, and then dealt, as so many of these things are, elaborated that over time to produce the really rich set of tools and capabilities and style guides, if you will, that really, again, make the data usable. Because even if I've got that place to put the diagnosis, if it's coded 3 different ways, our methods and our analyses get more complex. And this is still an unsolved problem today. In my day job, I spend time on, how do we exactly represent the start of an episode of a disease in a FHIR QA, data model, so that analytic methods can know where to look for it. So the problems kind of don't go away. But as we get, as a community, agreement on them, that's where we get the potency and the power. And I think, Patrick, I'm going to throw it to you next to just talk a little bit about that evolution from, I think we'd grown to 100-ish partners, people working on different academic centers, and growing increasingly people in other countries and other regulatory bodies and so on. But, we've obviously come a long way since then. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say none of us who got started on this thought, hey, let's build a data model in an international vocabulary mapping standard that will work for 11% of the world's population worth of data. That was not our intent.
That's what I was going for.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it was, at the time, it felt a little bit ambitious to have a common data model just to perform our experiment, but it seemed at the time that it was necessary. We couldn't imagine doing the experiments without a data model, not because we wanted a data model for the world, but because we needed a data model for ourselves. And I remember those early days when you and Christian talked about, well, I guess we're going to have to map vocabularies, and Christian's like, sure, I can just go ahead and figure that out with a few extra folks. And to think about how crazy ambitious that was, but for Christian to be like, I'll figure that out was kind of remarkable. And looking at the enduring value, I think the experiments we conducted were nice, and we've got some interesting insights that we gained. But actually, for a lot of people on this call, it's that data model and those vocabularies that most people are leaning on, and that wasn't the stated intent of our efforts initially. David and Mark, I see you both on in my screen of folks. I wonder if you have anything else to add about background setting in terms of the work we had done together.
Just one thought, or if I could go before Mark, just one thought is in my head here, which is back then, like 10-ish years ago, we couldn't get our papers published. So just the very idea that you could study these kinds of methods and how well they worked was totally foreign. And we had a real hard time just getting people beyond this is completely artisanal arts and crafts. Our papers were rejected over and over and over again with this kind of knee-jerk, you can't do that. It was actually very frustrating for a number of years. And then sort of the floodgates opened. Then we started to be able, we obviously there were a huge number of publications out of OMOP, but there was a period of time when we couldn't, we were just having an awful hard time breaking out.
Thank you, David. Mark, anything to add there?
Well, one thing that's come up in the chat that's important to remember is much of this discussion, or all of this discussion up to that point, had been US focused. And there was a major transition that still had to come to now encompass much greater portion of the world. And so I'd like to hear a bit more about that transition.
Absolutely. Yeah, so one thing I'll just add here is, so we are now going back in time. So OMOP started back in 2007. And actually when Paul and I got that, participated in that initial onset, it was supposed to be a 2-year fixed project that was supposed to end after 2 years. And we got started, and we did our 2 years, and we delivered the output of that. And then the executive board of the public-private partnership that was OMOP, chaired by Janet Woodcock at the FDA, asked us said, could you do some more experiments? And we actually ended up going a series of years, but explicitly our mandate was to conduct methodologic evaluations for drug safety. We were supposed to conduct experiments, generate evidence about the performance of a drug safety surveillance system, publish the findings, and hope that that information may inform, with our primary responsibility to try to support the FDA in their remit, but more generally, folks that were thinking about using observational data for safety. The transition into OHDSI, OHDSI was founded in 2014, so now going on about 7 years ago. And I remember vividly George Ribsack coming up to David Madigan's office at Columbia. Martine was visiting on a fellowship at Columbia, and the 4 of us sat down. And in that meeting, we were actually reviewing OMOP results and we conducted actually an analysis that George actually led a paper that was published called Medication-Wide Association Studies, MWAS, which was our little fun hack at all of the WASs that were going on at the time with the GWAS and PHWAS and what have you. And so we had our MWAS paper, which somehow hasn't really caught on. But I remember in that conversation, the discussion really becoming, this is great that we're doing this cool methods research. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually apply the methods research to start generating real answers? And so as OMOP, the methods experiment came to a close, Paul, Mark, and Christian, and David, and I, in addition to some additional newcomers like George, we said, well, why don't we actually create something different? And there was a few lessons that I got out of that time that I felt were important for us to transition, bringing some of the best parts over and then changing some things. The first was that I thought one of our successes in OMOP was this idea that we deeply relied on a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder perspective. I thought that it was super important that we actually tried to have the principles of open science. So we tried to make everything publicly available. I remember Paul, you and I thought that that was necessary simply because we were a pharma-funded thing that nobody was going to trust. So we said, well, how do we flip trust from a disadvantage to an advantage? Let's just put everything in the public domain so no one can argue about it. But I actually think that that was kind of a seminal decision that really kind of changes the tenor of how science is done. Also, Marc was a little bit humble in his discussion of the common data model, but early on, part of the reason we recognized the need for vocabulary was because we thought that even though we were doing something for the FDA, it would probably be useful for this to be something that could extend internationally. And so that early on, Marc and Christian said, well, if we're going to do this vocabulary thing, let's think about planning future ahead towards an international collaborative. And on our executive board of OMOP, we had a couple international participants, only a very small number. But what was remarkable is that their relative contribution and impact was pretty substantial. In terms of bringing a diverse perspective to the table. Not to mention that we conducted a methods competition that was called the OMOP Cup, and the far and away winner of that was some random international guy that happened to be Martijn Schumi, and pulled him into the community to engage with us. So the OHDSI really grew out a lot of the principles that we had in OMOP that we hold on to today. What I'd like to do here quickly is have a series of quick take questions just to hear reflections from those that were there. So to ask you that all of you briefly share, and I see that Judy's now joined on her phone, so she can kick off here. In your perspectives, can you tell me something that you think we got right during the OMOP days?
Well, I think that the approach of trying to, and I apologize for my internet provider, but the approach of trying to measure using metrics to try to measure how well we were able to get to, when we use this, the original OMOP experiment with the positive controls and the negative controls, and to actually use metrics to try to determine how useful these approaches were that, as Paul was saying, have been in textbooks and everybody relied on, but no one had ever tried to hold it up and measure the utility of these things. And I think that was a really a different approach and really valuable approach.
Patrick, I think your last comment is what I would jump in with. The full transparency took a lot of the distractions off the table, and frankly was pretty good timing as the whole scientific world was going through something around transparency with sharing data sets, so there could be replication of people disclosing anything that could be construed as biasing their ability to interpret the findings. So I thought that was a huge step, and still a fight going on these days, but certainly helped be very clear that we've really not only opened the kimono, but probably took it off completely.
And I was going to actually say the same thing, Paul, but I think the other thing, and Judy, you kind of alluded to this, is letting the data speak in many ways. And I think that was something we got right, and that was at all levels. The transparency, the results, the what does the data tell us, not what do we think, was something we got right from the beginning, and was really foundational for being able to make the headway that we did.
And Marc, I'll go back to you. What about something we got wrong?
About how long it would take. And not because we weren't making progress, but because it's an onion, right? I mean, all you guys have experienced this. It's you answer question 1, you get question 2, and you even heard a little bit of that this morning. Question 3, question 4, and now we're on question 963, which is phenomenal. But the other reason I think it took so long in some ways, and I was even back, and I think Patrick, you did some of this too, going back and reading Kuhn and things like that, and saying these are paradigm changes. How do you do a scientific paradigm change? And it takes time, as part of it, and transparency and things like that enable it, but it's still going to take time.
Judy, what did we do wrong?
I don't have a really snappy answer to this one. I'm still thinking about it.
Okay. Paul's always good for a snappy answer.
Yeah, right. I want to go back to something Dave Madigan mentioned, which was the publication side. And I know it was kind of interesting to me that we were not being bound by traditional thinking in the way we were looking at things and the studies we were doing, but somehow we were bound to the peer review process. And I remember having a bunch of discussions about, shouldn't we just publish a book or self-publish in some other way? And I think at that time, the whole movement towards open publication and posting things. So I frankly wonder if we burned a lot of time waiting around for the peer review process to kind of come around to it. So that's where I would point the finger.
The question we got in the chat that I'll throw to all of you is, what was the most surprising lesson learned that you had over the course of the journey? Judy?
You know, my working in drug safety at the FDA, well, now for 25 years, but back then for 15 years, you know, my interaction primarily with industry was sitting on the opposite side of the table. And so the experience of getting to collaborate in this way was just really, I want to say, I mean, it sounds eye-opening, maybe is too strong, but it was just getting to work together in a different way than in the more traditional, we're the regulator, your industry, and, you know, do this, this, and this. It was, you know, really scientific collaboration, bringing together different perspectives, my perspective from the regulatory point of view, and just bringing together all these different perspectives, and then, you know, trying to figure out a way forward with the data and the methods, and, you know, to support what the regulatory need was, and still is, which is really to, you know, try to understand as best we can the safety profile of the medications. So I think that getting to work in this collaborative way was really, I'm going to say, a blessing.
Very good. Marc, surprising lesson learned for you?
I mean, there's so many in many ways, you know, the things we discovered along the way is, you know, being one of them. But one of the things that I really remember just being like, holy cow, you know, not being a deep statistics nerd, the p hacking calibration work early on was one of those things I just went, holy cow, you know, I mean, you know those things in your mind, but bringing it home with the combination of the analyses and the visualizations that the team did early on was just a, you know, kind of a mind blower for me. So I'd have that on my short list anyway.
Very good. There's been several good questions in the chat, so I'm actually gonna table right now our game show to actually answer a couple of these serious questions that I think are really useful. As all of you were participants in this kind of relatively smaller effort that's now evolved into OHDSI, which is a bigger thing. I wonder whether you could comment on reflecting about exactly what that evolution was, and any suggestions you'd have for the broader OHDSI community about how we should be thinking about evolving even further.
I'll jump in. And it'll show my bias, because as I was transitioning from OMOP to the early OHDSI, and I had to pull back because of competing things, but I still think the biggest issue is communicating, certainly communicating uncertainty, but communication of study findings. Again, I'll beat up on the peer review process. It doesn't help anybody to publish a paper in even well-known journals if you don't make it accessible to, now much more than it was when we started, the patients that are making the decisions. So I've always had this as front and center for the things I think are important. I think the communication side, not just fancy graphics, but really figuring out what allows people to take this complex information on board and integrate it into a decision that they're making for themselves or for a loved one or a patient if they're a clinician.
Thanks, Paul. Judy?
I guess the word that pops into my mind is creativity. You know, we often think of that around the arts, but, you know, the creative thinking around where OMOP started and where it is and where OHDSI is today. I mean, that they're, you know, bringing and Patrick, I'm gonna, you know, I think you were a big driving force clearly behind a lot of this. And, you know, I think we mentioned this yesterday when we were sort of a little pre-meeting, you know, about this dashboard, using the Bradford Hill criteria and thinking about, you know, how taking what we're finding and then actually running it against these criteria to see, you know, how you know, these findings stand up. And, you know, you walking in with that dashboard one day and it's just like, whoa, you know, anyway, and so to see, you know, and you know, I've watched from a distance for a lot of these years. You know, I generally have gone to the annual symposium, but I haven't been, you know, but each year coming to the symposium and just being like, wow, you know, the you know, how this has grown and how, you know, but there's a lot of creative force behind that. And, you know, I know, you know, at one point, and you can see it actually on your wall behind you, is the artwork that was inspired by, you know, the visualization of the data and just that, you know, all of that, you know, just the creativity that, and I would just say that, you know, with the growth of the community, you just have more creativity there to help, you know, move this forward and figure out how best, you know, we can generate evidence going forward.
Very good. Marc?
Well, being the guy who's never satisfied, as you know, it's like no matter how much you get done, there's more to do, right? But I think one of my fondest wishes would be is to drive deeper, broader adoption. While we've grown across, you know, with the work you all have done, you've grown this thinking across many academic centers and research groups and so on. But there's still a whole lot, I would say, of these kind of studies and analyses that are being done without the benefit of all of the work and insights and learning. And so, especially living more on the commercial side of the world these days, as I do, you know, we're not doing this in Anthem. We weren't doing it inside of Cerner. We weren't, you know, there's a long way to go. And you know, it feels like there's more academic kind of understanding, insight, and adoption, perhaps. But even there, I think there's space to go. There's still a lot of work being done without the benefit of the learnings and insights and tools and capabilities. And we could be doing so much more, you know, than we are today. And again, that's not, you know, that's like the glass half empty side of the thing, you know, because I mean, clearly the huge amount of progress in the last decade in terms of people's insight and adoption. So I don't want that come across too negatively, but in terms of where to go, I think driving understanding and adoption, I'll call it in productionized kind of work, could go a long way towards improving the value of not just the work that OHDSI's done, but the analysis that those teams are doing.
So I guess that means that our journey's not over yet, even though it's been a good 15-year run here, but we still got a little bit more work to do. So while it's probably okay for those of us in the US to take a break with friends and family for the holiday week, we should all expect to get back at it on Monday and to continue this forward. I know we're near the top of the hour. I want to thank Judy and Paul and Marc for joining us or recounting kind of where we came from. It was great to see you all and hear your reflections. I think one of the things I'll take stock and I want to encourage everybody on the call, particularly those who are saying, like, you know, you're new to the community, is that this really did just start with a group of folks getting together and being friendly and saying, let's try to do something important and valuable together. And I don't think that there's anything that stops another group of friends from this community pick a problem and go after it with gusto. And encourage us to not just think about us as one giant community of lots of people, but think about this as an opportunity for you to engage in meaningful collaborations with those around you to tackle big problems. And you know, 10 years later, you can see progress that's been made. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Patrick. It was really
Yeah,
wonderful.
it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everybody for this great conversation. Patrick, I don't think you can have Oscar the Grouch on your desk for an hour and not explain why he's there. So let's end it with that.
I will say in our game show, this is going to make an appearance, but for those of you who don't know the backstory, OMOP, we used some pretty silly acronyms. I mean, OMOP's a kind of horrible acronym, but we tried to go Sesame Street style. So our data characterization tool was called Oscar, and our data quality tool was called Grouch. And so Judy gave me this, and it's been on my desk ever since. It's been like for 8 years, except for when Catherine takes it to play with it. This is always on my desk. In Odyssey, we of course created a data characterization tool called Achilles, and our data quality tool was initially Achilles heel. And so my real question is Oscar the Grouch a better acronym than Achilles heel for data quality? And so in light of Judy's contribution here, I'm going to say that Oscar the Grouch wins for this historical reference. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining the call. Thank you to Paul and Judy and Marc for joining. This conversation is really informative. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every question in the chat. I know Patrick had other things to talk about, so maybe we can do this again sometime. But to everybody in the U.S., have a happy Thanksgiving weekend. To everybody here, we'll see you Monday at the Open Source Governance Workshop, and then Tuesday for some award-winning community collaboration presentations. Thank you again.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.